Hi everyone, I'm Kyra Omland and I'm going to be presenting my undergraduate thesis on investigating attention mechanisms in children and their relationship to ADHD traits through event-related potentials in a visual audible paradigm with the help of my supervisor, Dr. Aaron Panda. So the purpose of my study is to investigate the brain mechanisms of attention allocation in children using self-reported high and low ADHD traits through a four-stimulus visual audible paradigm. To begin, I'm going to talk about what is ADHD. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and it is a neurodevelopmental condition that is associated with processing differences, including inconsistent attention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. And people with ADHD have a more bottom-up attention mechanism, which means that they focus on external distracting stimuli, such as novel and salient stimuli, like bright noises, bright lights, etc. Whereas someone without ADHD has a more top-down dominant attention mechanism, which means that they focus their attention on the task-relevant information and the goal of what they should be focusing on. And so there really is an imbalance between top-down and bottom-up attention in someone with ADHD. People with ADHD also have differences in executive functioning and attentional control. There is a need to view ADHD on a continuum instead of looking at whether someone is diagnosed or not, and having that as a more discrete or categorical representation of ADHD. There needs to be a view to look at ADHD on a continuum, as people with ADHD have differences in their symptom severity. For example, one person with ADHD that has a diagnosis might have a more severe symptom of hyperactivity than another person diagnosed with ADHD. And so there's a need to look at ADHD in terms of it being on a continuum, on a scale per se. So for example, again, a person who is diagnosed with ADHD might have similar traits and similar severity of ADHD traits as another person who is not diagnosed with ADHD. Moving forward, I'm going to be talking about what is the audible paradigm. So the audible paradigm is a computer-based task used to look at the differences in cognitive functioning and attention allocation. My study uses a four-stimulus visual audible paradigm, which I will be discussing in more detail later. The whole purpose of the audible paradigm is to provide information between ADHD and attention processing. So further, because of the audible paradigm, we can see how attention is detected in the brain, the sequence of neurocognitive processes using event-related potentials, or ERPs. And we can also see, using the audible paradigm, when processing occurs. And to do this, we use EEG. What have past audible paradigms examining ADHD found regarding the N2 ERP component? To start off, I'm going to be discussing exactly what is the N2. So the N2 happens at the frontal region of the brain, and it is a negative going peak. It happens early onset of the stimulus, and it reflects response inhibition and categorization. So as you can see here in my little figure, for my graph, you can see that the N2 I highlighted, and it is a negative going peak occurring around the 200 millisecond range, but that can vary up to a little over 320 milliseconds as well. The N2 from past research has been reported to be smaller to target stimuli, non-target stimuli, and standard stimuli in those with ADHD compared to those without ADHD. This suggests that people with ADHD have a difference in attention shift to targets. They have differences in early sensory categorization, attention resource recruitment, stimulus separation processing. And for the P3 ERP component, to start off, the P3 happens at the back of the scalp. I'm going to be talking about the P3B, whereas the P3A happens more frontally. It is a positive going peak. It is a late peak that occurs between 300 and 600 milliseconds. The P3 reflects memory, context processing, task-relevant stimuli, resource allocation, difficulty of a task. Again, you can see here in my graph, I highlighted the P3. The P3 can happen more than once between 300 and 600 milliseconds. As you can see in the graph here, there are two P3s, P3A and P3B. I also want to mention that from past literature, it was found that a pattern results have found that people with ADHD, including children and adults, have a smaller P3 to target stimuli and standard stimuli compared to those without ADHD. So this suggests that people with ADHD, again, have a more bottom-up dominant directed attention processing by focusing on the task irrelevant stimuli and that novel, distracting, salient stimuli compared to people without ADHD. And again, people with ADHD have differences in evaluating and processing the target stimuli by that smaller amplitude. So what about responses to novel stimuli, or what has been referred to as the novelty effect? Well, few studies have actually investigated the novelty effects in people with and without ADHD, and there has been conflicting results. So, for one study that has been recently published, they found that adults with ADHD had a larger P3 amplitude to novel stimuli compared to adults without ADHD. Another study found that children with ADHD had a larger P3 to novel stimuli compared to children without ADHD. However, another conflicting study found that children with ADHD actually had a smaller P3 to all stimuli, including novels, compared to children without ADHD. So there's a need to really look at this, and that's why it makes my research so exciting, as past research has been limited on the novelty effects and the results are not consistent. This suggests, however, from the results I just talked about from previous literature, that people with ADHD process novels as if task-relevant stimuli by, again, having a larger amplitude towards novel stimuli. And they also induce involuntary attention by focusing on that salient, distracting stimuli, and novels induce that behavior. This also suggests that people with ADHD need more engagement to focus and redirect their focus on that task-relevant stimuli compared to getting distracted by the novel stimuli. And perhaps this suggests that novelty processing depends on task demand, so whether a task is easy or hard. Moving forward, I'm going to be talking about the present study. So my study is really unique because it is the only study that is looking at ADHD in terms of self-reported ADHD traits and grouping children's scores using a community-based sample into high and low ADHD trait groups to look at attention allocation using a four-stimulus visual ALBA paradigm. Again, I want to reiterate that for my study, we use the self-report ADHD traits from the Conners 3 short form. Moving forward to my research question and hypotheses, my research question is, what is the relationship between self-report ADHD traits and the amplitude of the N2 and P3 ERP components during a four-stimulus ALBA paradigm with novel distractors? My first hypothesis is children with high ADHD traits will have a smaller N2 and P3 amplitude to target stimuli compared to children with low ADHD traits. My second hypothesis regarding novelty is it is undetermined whether novelty effects will differ significantly between the two groups. However, following previous research, children with high ADHD traits should have a larger P3 amplitude towards novel stimuli compared to children with low ADHD traits. Moving on to my methods of my study, again, we used a community sample of participants. So that means that we used children who did and did not have an ADHD diagnosis and also could have other comorbid disorders as well as ADHD. And so we really did not use a clinical sample per se with or without ADHD. We used people from around the region. Our whole study consisted of children aged 7 to 18, but for my study, I used a subsample of children from the ages of 7 to 13, with a total of 58 participants, 29 both male and female. They completed the Conners 3 self-report short form that assesses their ADHD traits, and then their ADHD scores, their total ADHD scores, were then listed so that I could then categorize them as either being in the high or low ADHD trait group based on where their scores fell. So total ADHD scores that are self-report fell between 18 and 31 were in the high ADHD trait group, and then scores ranging from 2 to 11 fell in the low ADHD trait group. I also accounted for any sex and age differences using chi-square tests and independent t-test to make sure that age and sex differences between the two groups were not going to conflict my results or be third variable problems, and they were found to be not significant, which is a good thing, which means that age and sex did not account for my results. As you can see here on my little graph, you can see that I have outlined roughly where the self-reported HD traits are for the low and high groups. Again, low ranging from 2 to 11 total HD scores, and for high ranging between 18 and 31. This led to me having 18 participants in the high HD trait group and 21 in the low HD trait group. Moving forward, I'm going to talk about the Conners 3 self-report short form. This is a form that looks at hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. So as you can see here, I just did a sample question of what the form would look like. The first question is from the hyperactivity impulsivity subsection, and the second question is from the inattentive subsection. The short form was based on a 4-point Likert scale, and again, we used the self-report version of the children's own self-ADHD traits, not the parent report. So for the four stimulus visual ALBA paradigm of my study, this consisted of 200 triangles that served as frequent and task irrelevant stimuli, 50 squares that served as the target stimuli that were infrequent but task relevant, 50 circles that were categorized as non-targets that were infrequent and task irrelevant, and 50 nameable and non-nameable line drawings that were considered novels and they were infrequent and task irrelevant. So the goal of the paradigm is to click a button whenever the target stimuli appeared, so whenever the square appeared, and to withhold when any other stimuli appeared, so any standard, non-target, or novel stimuli. So to begin for my analysis, I decided to look at all 58 participants before I grouped them into high and low ADHD traits, and I wanted to see if there were any significance or correlations, and I did a bivariate correlational analysis. However, that revealed no significance between ADHD traits and N2 and P3 amplitude. Because of this, I decided to categorize my participants as either being in the high or low ADHD to look at ADHD trait groups, to look at the very end extremes of any differences or any group differences between the participants that had really high significant or really high amplified ADHD traits, and then look at and compare them to the children who had low ADHD traits that were not as dominant. And because of this, I found that regarding the N2 ERP component, that there was a main effect of condition with a larger N2 to novel stimuli than the other stimuli. This is really interesting because this was apparent for both groups. So in the high and low ADHD trait groups, there was a larger N2 to novel stimuli compared to the other stimuli. As you can see here in my two graphs, I have outlined that the N2 happens around 200 to 320 milliseconds in both groups, and it is the largest negative going peak, and that is for novel stimuli or in response to novel stimuli compared to the other stimuli. There was no difference between groups, meaning that one ADHD trait group did not have a significantly larger or smaller amplitude towards the N2 than the other. Moving forward for the P3, there was a main effect of condition. This was apparent for all 3 time windows and to the 2 ADHD trait groups. So there was a larger P3 amplitude to target stimuli compared to the other stimuli. For, again, all 3 time windows, you can see here that in my 2 graphs, I have the high and low ADHD trait groups. And you can see here from 300 to 600 milliseconds of each peak that was largest to targets, and that was apparent for both ADHD trait groups. Again, the target stimuli is in blue. And you can see here that it is the largest compared to the other stimuli. Main effective condition was expected, indicating that children understood that the target stimuli was the task relevant stimuli. However, it was also expected that there would be a main effect of group differences, indicating that was expected for the high ADHD trait group to have smaller amplitudes towards target stimuli compared to the low ADHD trait group, but that was not found. However, it was really interesting because for my study, during the late P3 time window, again happening between 500 and 600 milliseconds, there was a marginally significant effect of group. So because of this, again, it was the significant p-value was ranging from 0.05, greater than 0.05, but less than 0.1, making it marginally significant. And I did some independent t-tests to follow up and see where exactly this was significant for, or marginally significant for. And I actually found that for the high ADHD trait group, they had significantly larger amplitudes to standards than children with low ADHD traits. And this was also marginally significant for non-targets. So children in the high ADHD trait group had marginally significant larger amplitudes to non-target stimuli compared to children in the low ADHD trait group. As you can see here in my 2 pictures, I have their responses to standard stimuli, and then I have the responses to non-target stimuli. And you can see that in blue, that is represented as the high ADHD trait group, and they have larger amplitudes. This insinuates that for the N2, because both high and low ADHD trait groups had a larger N2 to novel stimuli compared to the other stimuli, that both groups of children have similar response inhibition mechanisms, and there is more effort needed to categorize novels as task irrelevant by both groups. As for the N2, they were focused on that novel stimuli, that distracting and salient stimuli compared to the target stimuli. Regarding the P3 ERP component, there was a main effect of condition to targets. Again, children in both the high and low ADHD trait groups had a larger P3 amplitude to target stimuli than the other stimuli. However, there were no group differences. This insinuates that both children in both groups correctly identified targets as task relevant stimuli by that larger amplitude to that stimuli, and more attention was focused on targets compared to the other stimuli. Again, for the high ADHD trait group, from that marginally significant main effective group for the late P3, this insinuates that children in the high ADHD trait group process standards as if task relevant, and the P3 occurred for longer for the standard stimuli compared to children in the low ADHD trait group. And perhaps that their filtering mechanism is similar between non-targets and targets by that marginally significant effect of non-targets having a larger amplitude for the high ADHD trait group than the low ADHD trait group. And perhaps that they process non-targets similar to how they processed novel stimuli. Regarding the novelty effect of children with high ADHD traits, again, there were no significant group differences to novel stimuli, but it was expected from past literature that there should be group differences to novel stimuli, insinuating that children in the high ADHD trait group should have had larger amplitudes to novel stimuli than children in the low ADHD trait group, but that was not found. Again, this insinuates that for all children regarding the N2 and their larger amplitude to novel stimuli, that higher involuntary attention allocation happened between both groups, and they were focusing on that distracting stimuli. And perhaps this insinuates that both ADHD trait groups found novels to be exciting, interesting, attention-grabbing stimuli by again focusing on that and putting more attentional resources on novels. As you can see here, I have a picture of an example of nameable and non-nameable line drawings that were our novel stimuli in the paradigm. So limitations of the study and extra analyses that I did. One limitation of our study was using Connor's self-report scores instead of using a clinical diagnosis. So again, we used a community-based sample of children. Whether or not they had ADHD or not, we did not use a sample of children who strictly either had an ADHD diagnosis or did not. And that was a limitation of our study, as results could have differed because we used a community-based sample and not a clinical diagnosis, as the past literature that I have found used children with or without ADHD or adults with or without ADHD. Another limitation of my study is medication use. So one child in the high ADHD trait group does have ADHD and was on medication during the study, and this could have caused the results that we have now, because one study found that children with ADHD on medication had smaller amplitudes compared to children without ADHD. And so because of this, I reran my analysis to exclude that child with ADHD on medication, and I actually found that the results were the same. So the results did not differ, and perhaps this was because only one child was excluded, and so that did not change the results that much compared to if more additional children were excluded because of medication. But that's something to really look into moving forward. And another limitation of the study is how we used self-report ADHD traits based on the Connors 3 short form compared to the parent report version of the short form. As a previous study that used parent report ADHD traits found smaller P3 amplitudes in children with ADHD compared to children without ADHD. Because of this, I reran the analysis again. This time I used the ADHD traits based off the parent report version, and I separated the children based on their parent report version of their total ADHD scores into new, high, and low ADHD trait groups. And I actually found a difference in the results. I found that regarding the N2 ERP component, again, that happens around 200 milliseconds, and it is a negative going peak, that there was a significant interaction between condition and group. Again, that was not found for my initial results using self-report. However, based on parent report, there were more females in the low ADHD trait group and more males in the high ADHD trait group. And when I accounted for age and sex differences, that was significant. Also, for the high ADHD trait group, based on parent report, there were 5 participants with an ADHD diagnosis, compared to when I used self-report. In the high group, there was only 1 participant. As you can see here, I just did some analyses regarding medication, and I did not change the results, and then using parent report instead of self-report, and there was a significant interaction. Again, I want to reiterate my results regarding the N2 and P3. There was a main effect of condition, the N2 to novel stimuli, and the P3 to target stimuli, and this was apparent for both ADHD trait groups. There was no main effect of group, and there was a marginally significant effect of group for the late P3 time window happening between 500 and 600 milliseconds. And I looked into this further and found that children in the high ADHD trait group significantly had larger amplitudes regarding the late P3 to standard stimuli compared to children in the low ADHD trait group, suggesting that they process standards as if task relevant and they process standards longer. Additionally, I also found that children in the high ADHD trait group process non-targets perhaps similar to how they process novels by finding it to be attention-grabbing and, again, that distracting task-irrelevant stimuli. However, future research is needed as not many studies have looked at ADHD on a continuum and looked at ADHD traits, whereas other studies in past literature have only looked at children with or without a diagnosis. It's really important to continue to study children with all levels of ADHD traits and their attention mechanisms to understand how children process the world around them and to form better interventions in school, extracurriculars, etc. to succeed. And I wanted to thank you all, and yeah.